It's the Happy Families Podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
A quick content warning before we start today's podcast. Some of the material in today's podcast may not be suitable for younger listeners. While not explicit, we will be talking about some particularly challenging things. Therefore, this is your warning. Here's a heads up for what we will be discussing. Number one, we're going to talk about the increasing levels that we seem to be seeing of bullying, particularly the kind of bullying and catfishing and online issues that have led to the untimely and completely avoidable deaths of far too many teenagers in Australia this year. Additionally, we'll be talking about sextortion and what's going on online with teenage boys. My guest today on the podcast is Julie Inman-Grant, Australia's eSafety Commissioner. In her role as eSafety Commissioner, Julie Inman-Grant is responsible for ensuring that all Australians, especially our kids, have safer and more positive experiences online. Australia is the only nation in the world to have a government agency that is dedicated to online safety, as far as I'm aware. Julie has created a pioneering, innovative and citizen-focused office, making an impact both here at home and globally. She's been a passionate advocate of promoting technology for good and has been working at the intersection of tech and social policy for more than 25 years. She's been dedicated to combating all forms of child sexual exploitation, online cyber abuse, and has worked tirelessly to promote and protect the voices of women, children, and vulnerable communities online, and more recently, young men as well. Julie Inman-Grant, welcome to the Happy Families Podcast.
Let's just keep trying to make those families happier.
Julie, it's school holidays around the corner for pretty much everyone in the country, and kids are invariably going to end up on screens a little bit more at this time of year than they would at any other time of the year, in spite of the warm weather and all that sort of thing, just because, well, they're not at school. There are a couple of things that have really been on my mind a lot as I've watched the way screens continue to inhabit our kids' lives. In the last couple of months, there have been several suicides of young children, 12, 14, 16 years of age, primarily related to bullying, cyberbullying, catfishing, all sorts of things happening online. I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about the role of the eSafety Commissioner and the resources that are available and how parents are supposed to respond when their kids are being bullied online. And they say, and we've read about it in the paper, allegedly the families have gone to the schools. They've said, we've got a problem here. And for whatever reason, the schools are not able to deal with it. The problem isn't going away. And in too many cases, we've seen the loss of life. How do we work through this, and what role can you play?
Listen, the loss of life like this, particularly of children so young, is absolutely devastating. But as you know, as a trained psychologist, there is always a lot to it. It's usually not one factor, but there's no question that when you may have underlying issues and there's face-to-face bullying, if there's cyberbullying on top of that, that's a hugely compounding factor. And I think that's what makes cyberbullying so insidious. It's pervasive and invasive. You know, you're not just leaving the bullying behind at the school gates. It's following these children in their supercomputers in their pockets into their homes. And depending on the rules that you have in the household, some kids are taking devices into their rooms and maybe on all night and be, exposed to a constant barrage of bullying. So we've seen children much younger since the COVID pandemic getting onto social media sites before they're ready. In fact, we just put out some youth research showing that 84% of 8 to 12-year-olds are online now, and that equates to about 1.3 million kids in primary school years that are likely on social media and messaging apps. So we need to be engaged in our kids' online lives. Now, eSafety is really unique in that we offer the world's only government-backed cyberbullying service in the world. So if a child is cyberbullied and they report to the platform and that doesn't come down, they can report to us, as can a parent, a carer, or a designated educator or other supervisor. And we have a 90% success rate in terms of getting that content down. So this is what we see and what we know is that online abuse or cyberbullying is almost always peer-to-peer, and it's almost always tied to conflict happening within the school gates. So that's where that compounding effect happens. Often kids are reluctant to report to a platform because they think that they won't do anything, let alone a government agency, or to talk to a parent because they're afraid of device denial. They also don't want to be the dauber or the snitch. But I would say that particularly when a child is being targeted by multiple people or in really damaging ways, the best thing we can do is rapidly remove that content. And often with the consent of the child or the parent, we often, for underage kids, encourage them to get their parents involved. We also involve the school community, and we find that once the core of the conflict is removed and there is visibility around the school community and the parent community that this bullying has happened, it tends to dissipate. And there are lots of complexities there. But again, just getting the content taken down can provide tremendous relief. And then we often we've got a contractual arrangement with Kids Helpline. So where we see kids are really hurting or may need mental health support, we refer those kids on.
Julie, what percentage of parents know about eSafety Commissioner capacity there? Do you have any research on that to show the extent to which families in the Australian community are aware that you are there and have those powers to have content removed from these social media sites?
I would say not as many as we want, probably closer to the 40% mark.
Right.
But this is precisely why I do podcasts like this, just to let parents and educators know that we're here to help. In fact, I've just written letters to the principals of Shalom College in St. Sabine and Redlands College in Queensland to let them know. And it feels terrible in a way because this is our worst case scenario, that a cyberbullying incident, along with other factors, would escalate to the point where a child feels that they have no way out, when we can provide that relief and that support. We have very good relationships with all of the platforms, from TikTok to Instagram to Snapchat. And I can tell you that none of them want to see young people being bullied online. I'd also say there are a couple of other concerning trends that we're starting to see. And that is that young people are becoming much more aggressive and being much more persistent and pervasive with their targeting of other children. We're seeing more fight videos, which is almost sent as a way to dox people. We're seeing really violent use of language by kids as young as 14, threatening rape and death threats. So we've started to use what we call our end user notice powers, where we do this in conjunction with parents and the school community, but it's essentially a cease and desist notice that we send to these kids that say, you must take this content down, you must write an apology letter to the target, you must commit that you will not engage in this kind of behavior again. And the reason we use this as a deterrent, because we do not want children at this age thinking that they can harass, intimidate, threaten, and humiliate others with total impunity. And I would say there's some schools that are really excellent and get very engaged, and there are some schools that are quite disengaged. There was a case where we were very concerned about a contagion effect of self-harm, where teenage girls were inciting other girls to engage in more violent forms of cutting, really. And the principal at that school refused to become engaged. They said, oh, this is happening after school hours. These are not devices owned by the schools. And I guess my entreaty to schools would be, these are students in your school community. If there's a contagion happening within your community, you have to get involved and take a stand. We've got a range of tools for educators as well, what we call the tools for schools. We provide virtual classrooms for teachers, professional training for teachers, but also virtual classrooms for kids.
Julie, to what extent do you think parents are aware that their kids are saying this sort of stuff. I mean, when I was a kid, I'd get cranky at one of my friends. I'd say, "Oh, you're dead meat," and that was just what we said. I mean, if I heard my kids say that today, I'd be so cranky at them. We can't speak like that, and yet when I was a kid, it didn't seem like it was that big of a deal. When they're making these kinds of threats, there's really two questions here. Number one, do you think that they realize just what they're saying in the same way that I don't think I really understood what I was saying when I said you're dead meat? And number two, do you think parents have got any idea what their kids are doing and saying online?
Whenever our investigators look at the content, we always look at the context and, is this just kind of grandstanding or, I'm going to kill you. But what we're seeing is much more deliberate, very concerning, targeted, specific threats of harm. Or I'm just thinking of one where there was a group of kids that had beaten up another kid and he was unconscious and they continued to kick him. And they sent that video around as almost an intimidating factor. And these were young kids that seemed to show no or little mercy. I mean, I have to say sometimes I'm shocked with the language that's being used. And then there's some really deliberate tactics. There's something called phoenixing where one child will set up to 50 or 60 accounts with the target's name. And, they know that as their abuse gets reported and comes down, there will be another one that rises up in the ashes. And that the whole intent is to just put constant pressure on the person. So it's a very insidious way of continuing to target a child. There is some deliberate tactic there.
And parents, you've got to assume that the parents just are completely oblivious to this, that they're simply not monitoring, not aware that this is going on.
So yes, and sometimes no. What's really, really interesting is some parents are absolutely shocked. They have no idea. And then you have other parents who take a very defensive position. My child would never do or say anything like that, even when we present them with evidence. I do think this is where role modeling as a parent is so important. The language we use around the house, the way we talk to each other, the way we talk to kids. Kids are sponges. They pick this up. And if they're not picking it up from you, they could be picking it up from cultural product and their peers. This is why we have to kind of guide kids along, particularly, before they reach their teenage years and they want to be more independent, to ensure that we're engaging. As I was just saying to you, Justin, I was shocked when I let my then 6th grade twins use my phone number so that they could communicate with their peers, to see some of their peers using the C word and some other words was really quite confronting to me. And, I ended up talking to some of the parents, just saying, I know you, I'm sure you don't talk like this around the house, but you need to know that your child is using this kind of language.
I want to go back to something that you raised before, and that is your powers to have content removed. If you've got a child who's being bullied, if you've got the evidence of it, if there's a way that a report can be made to the eSafety Commissioner office and something can be done there, to what extent can you have content removed from, so WhatsApp, for example, and Facebook Messenger, these are now encrypted. And therefore, because it's behind that encryption, do you still have powers to get in there? Do you have the capacity to get into the encrypted spaces? I don't know what other apps offer that now, but I'm sure that they're not the only two. How much can you get in there and get that content removed?
Well, that's where we have to actually work with the platforms informally. We don't have specific app removal powers, but what can be done, and we're seeing more bullying moving from, social media bullying, which was really the genesis for the Online Safety Act in 2015, when, kids were posting to Facebook.
Yep.
What we do is we ask kids and we show them how to collect the evidence through a screenshot, that there's a specific account and what the content is. You can screenshot that information and report it as bullying. If it contravenes WhatsApp services or WhatsApp's terms of service, we can flag it up informally for the platform. there's usually a pattern or a signal that they can pick up. And what we find, those that bully some usually bully others. So there are some cases where the platforms will take action. As I said, we have the 90% success rate we have is because we work cooperatively with the platforms, and we just point out that this is violating their terms of service. And a policy is only as good as its enforcement, and we serve as that backstop. Sometimes a platform might say, we don't agree with you. If you want this content taken down, send us a formal removal notice, and we'll do that if we think the situation warrants it.
Julie, we bumped into each other a month and a half ago at South by Southwest. It's a big conference was being held in Sydney, and backstage I asked you if there was anything that was particularly on your mind. You highlighted that the last time we spoke, teenage boys and sextortion was one of your chief concerns, and you indicated to me backstage that it hasn't moved. In fact, it's only increased in terms of the degree to which you're concerned about it. Could you, for those who are not familiar with what's going on with teenage boys and sextortion, talk a bit about that, and specifically the sadistic sexual sextortion that is becoming increasingly frequent?
Yeah, it is really concerning. So just to put things in context, in 2018, we received something like 432 reports of sexual extortion through our image-based abuse scheme. We've seen an over 1,300% increase and had over 6,200 reports in 22-23, and we haven't finished tallying for this year. And so there are two types of sexual extortion. There's financial sexual extortion that is primarily committed by overseas criminal gangs. So the same criminal gangs like the Yahoo boys out of Nigeria, who used to send the princess was kidnapped, or you've won a lottery that you didn't enter. They figured out that young boys between the ages of 16 and 24, so young men really, are much more responsive to a attractive blonde Instagram account asking if they want a sexy chat, and taking off their clothes or masturbating before a camera usually within an hour or two. They're that effective. And the minute that happens, they use a combination of guilt and shame. Often they've done a lot of research about the target. They will know by looking at the Instagram followers who their girlfriend is, who their parents are, and they will threaten to share unless money is given. And often it's not just cash. It might be through crypto. It might be through gift cards. And so there's a whole manifesto for these organized criminals on how to really back a child into a corner, or a young man into a corner. And the reason they're targeting young men is they're more likely to have jobs and have means as well. But their brains are still developing, right? So they might not be thinking straight. And so they try and back them into a corner and make them panic. Now, sadistic sexual extortion tends to happen more to girls. And that also preys upon fear and leads individuals to kind of comply with demands in hopes of escaping humiliation. But there's a real emotional toll, which creates anxiety, depression, a shattered sense of security. And often this targets young girls. And they're not always looking for financial reward, but these might be predators that will look for more explicit kinds of videos, or will command that they do certain things or be online at certain times. There are perpetrators of sadistic sextortion that engage in this prolonged harassment and use really sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques to exploit their victims' vulnerabilities. So we just dealt with a really heartbreaking one of a 14-year-old girl last week. We had cooperation from the platform, so we were able to intercede and then refer on to the ACE at the AFP as active grooming. But it's amazing when we are able to engage with parents when the kids are underage, and so many parents say, "Oh, my kid's smarter than that. They wouldn't engage in that. They wouldn't do that." It's really amazing how many young people fall prey to this. And it's really, really disturbing and distressing.
Julie, when we did Parental Guidance Season 2, we got in touch with the Australian Federal Police and ACE, the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation, and we did this thing where the kids got online and we approached them. We had an actor approach them and try to get personal details from them and arrange a meet-up. And it was devastating as the parents watched their children fall prey to this actor who I mean, had no ill intent. He was an actor and he was being guided by the police to do it. But it was absolutely devastating, just crushing. The hardest part of all, though, is that the parents whose children made those mistakes said, we've had the talk. We spent time with the kids. It's not just that it was a one-off talk. We've had these conversations, and yet kids are vulnerable and they want to be liked and they want to explore and they're curious. They're just so vulnerable. Conversations like the one that we've just had, in so many ways, it's depressing. It's concerning. It sometimes makes it feel like it's all too hard. But the reason we have to have these conversations is so that parents know that this is a reality for way too many of our kids, and they need to know that you've got the resources there to provide them with the support. There is actually hope, and hopefully, if anything ever does happen to anyone, they can go to you.
Yeah, and we've worked really closely with law enforcement agencies across the country to get out those prevention messages. And those are really, if somebody asks you for a sexy chat, don't take off your clothes for anyone you don't know as a real person. But if you do, it's not your fault. Disclose to someone, disclose. Don't carry this alone. And again, that one of the tactics is to isolate the person. I get teary when I talk about this, but we met with a Victorian coroner, and he had the names of 17 different young men who had taken their lives as a result of image-based abuse or extortion. And I read one of the suicide notes where they said, "Mom, Dad, I messed up. I'm sorry. Goodbye." I'm sure every single parent you ever talk to would want of them to say, "I'm just down the hall. I don't care what you did. If you're in trouble, I'm here. I'm gonna help you." And it makes you feel so sad, because these are young adults, and that's the other thing I worry about, is that we might think, okay, this young man is 18, he's technically adult, but he may not have the same pastoral care. Or maybe in transition, is no longer in school, maybe in uni or at TAFE or doing a trade, and still not have really found themselves. And, I think we expect a lot of young adults in terms of taking on things like this. And I just think we have to remember that we need to be there for our kids always.
Yeah. Two things as you share that. Number one, over the last couple of months, I've had a couple of conversations with parents whose boys have gone to them and said, I've made a terrible mistake and things are about to get really bad. What a gift it is that they've been willing to have that conversation. What an absolutely wonderful thing. I mean, it still doesn't always work out. Recently on Channel 10, there was a terrible story about a young man who, some months after everything had sort of washed over, it was still too much for him. But the more that we can let our children know that our love for them is bigger than anything that they could ever do, the more likely it is that we get good outcomes.
Just the other thing is we can get that content taken down.
Yeah.
So they can come to us. We will always provide whatever kind of wraparound support we can, and we also tell people not to pay, because if you pay, they'll keep coming back, and block them and collect the evidence, and we'll work with the police and we'll do what we can. You probably will never get your money back, but we can try and get the imagery down, and people can leave with their dignity intact, because they're being socially scammed and engineered to the nth degree.
Yeah, that's what I was literally about to say. The good news is the eSafety Commissioner has the powers to act on that, and if people just knew that you were there, which is obviously the purpose of this conversation, they'd know that there's an opportunity there for some sort of redemption, for some sort of hope out of it. So a couple of big topics, Julie. Bullying, it's not going away, and as you've said, in some ways it's becoming even more vindictive and more challenging. But you have the powers to act and to help kids to be safer. And obviously with the sextortion for boys and the sadistic sexual sextortion for girls, again, the powers are there so that if people need anything, they can go to the eSafety website and get the support that they need. For those who are not familiar with what you do and where to find you, could you just give us a couple of quick pointers on that?
Yep, esafety.gov.au, everything is there. So there's parent guides in multiple languages. You can search based on apps that your kids may be using. You can search based on issue, whether it's extortion or cyberbullying. And reporting abuse is right up top. We take reports of child sexual abuse material, terrorist content, youth-based cyberbullying, image-based abuse, which is the sharing of intimate images and videos. This includes deep fakes, and then adult cyber abuse.
And there's so much more we could talk about, but our time is absolutely well and truly gone. It's such an important conversation, though. Julie Inman-Grant, Australia's eSafety Commissioner, thank you for being so helpful and so generous with your time.
Thank you.
What an important conversation. If you need support, obviously the esafety.gov.au website will be a useful place. But if this has stirred up anything else for you, there are a range of different helplines around, including Lifeline, Kids Helpline, Parent Line, Men's Healthline, 13Yarn, and so many others. Please, please, please make sure that you take care of yourself and those that you love. The Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rulon from Bridge Media. If you'd like more information about the things we've talked about today, you'll find that at esafety.gov.au. We'll link to that in the show notes. And for more about making your family happier, try happyfamilies.com.au.